This is the Louie Tee Network.
In the lab room.
10 minutes or less. Oakland Raiders. Welcome, you are in the lab room. I'm your host, Lou. Thank you for joining me here on the program. Oakland Raiders, 10 minutes or less. So, clock, let's go. Season rewind for the Oakland Raiders. And it was another tough one for the man with one eye. When you don't have a lot of resources and you got to make do with what you have, it can be a tough go of it. We'll talk about the Raiders and their situation a little bit later. But you go into the regular season with Terrell Pryor as your starting quarterback, TP2. So you're thinking, all right, let's see what the guy has. And you go into that first game of the season against the Colts on the road, Andrew Luck, playoff team from a season ago, and you're thinking, man, these guys are going to be blown out. And the Raiders show up, and they almost steal one. Now, we know there are no moral victories in the National Football League, but damn it if the Raiders weren't close in week one. You had to feel good about what you saw from Terrell Pryor and what you saw from your football team as a whole. You go into the next week, you beat the Jacksonville Jaguars at home. Then you got to play the Broncos. They had been blowing teams out, scoring over 40. You managed to keep them from scoring 40 points. So you feel good about that. You still lose the game, of course, but then Terrell Pryor goes down. You lose a game that probably you would win if Terrell Pryor doesn't go down with the injury against the Broncos, against the Redskins. You end up getting to the bye at 2-4. So you come off the bye and you get an improbable victory versus the Steelers. Now, we know the Steelers were struggling last year, but it's still the Pittsburgh Steelers, still the Oakland Raiders. Steelers are supposed to win. They didn't, and you had to feel good about that. So much so that at 3-4, you felt like, hey, we might be on to something here. And so this next game in week number 9 was huge for me, for both teams. Eagles at the Raiders. Eagles came into the game at 3-5. Raiders came into the game at 3-4. And I'm thinking the winner of this game is going to catapult themselves into a position to make a run for the postseason. Now, I know it's week 9, and it's a little early to be talking postseason using that P word. However, I just felt really strongly about this game. Two teams going somewhat in opposite directions. The winner of this game would have a chance to turn their season around. We all know what happened. The Eagles exploded. Nicholas Foles started his streak of all these touchdown passes, no interceptions, had 7 touchdowns in that game against the Raiders. Raiders go south after that game. Eagles elevate themselves to a playoff team. So that was really a huge game in retrospect. And so the Raiders, after that loss, proceed to lose 7 out of their final 8. Finish up the season at 4-12. Hence, we find ourselves at the 2014 off season. So now you look at this Raiders football team, and from a building a franchise perspective, there are steps that you must take. And to me, there are 3 different phases that you go through as an organization in order to build your team and your franchise from the ashes. And the first thing you have to do is find the right man or men. In the case of the Raiders, men in terms of head coach Dennis Allen and GM Reggie McKenzie. So find the right guys in the front office, find the right head coach, check if you are the Raiders, or at least you're hoping, check. Then the next thing is clean up the books, purge the roster. Okay, normally when you're a bad team and you're a perennial bad team, your roster is pretty bad. Hence, the Raiders roster has been pretty bad, and their books was a mess when Reggie McKenzie got there and they didn't have any draft picks. So, clean up the books, get your draft in order, and purge the roster. Check. So now you're on to the final phase. Get good players onto your football team, start winning football games. You got to make sure you take advantage of the offseason, whether it's the draft or free agency. Get good players on your team, coach them up, start winning. The Raiders are in that final phase now. They've gotten all of the other things out of the way, and owner Mark Davis has made it abundantly clear in this offseason. No more excuses, guys. We got money under the cap. Raiders have over $60 million worth of cap space available, by far the most in the National Football League in 2014. So that's not an excuse. They got a full complement of picks in this year's draft, including a first-round pick, which seems to have escaped them the last couple of years. They did have a first-rounder last year, actually traded out of their spot and gained some more picks. So and now they got a full complement of picks in the draft. They got money to spend. Time to go and win. So in Mark Davis's thinking right now, just win, baby. Just win. So no excuses. He's already said, no excuses, fellas. Let's win some ball games this year. So you got to get it done if you're the Raiders. So let's look at their free agents and see who they want to bring back in the list of guys that they have up for free agency this year. So you look at the list of Raiders that are up for free agency. Rashard Jennings, Darren McFadden, Jacoby Ford, Jerron Mastrud, Tony Pashos, Jared Valdir, Andre Garrard, Lamar Houston, Jason Hunter, Daniel Muir, Pat Sims, Vance Walker, Phillip Adams, Mike Jenkins, Tracy Porter, Charles Woodson, Usama Young, Brandon Ross, and Jameez Alawale. So those last two are restricted free agents. And you look at the list of Raiders that you want back. And this team has a plethora of needs. And I talked about rebuilding this roster. So there are a lot of vacancies on this roster. But when you find hidden gems, when you find guys that you think can get it done at this level and have performed for you in the past, and you feel like that past performance is an indicator of what they'll do for you in the future, you need to bring them back, especially when you're trying to build a foundation in terms of a roster. So you look at that roster, and the first name that jumps off the page at me is offensive tackle, left tackle, and that's one of the most important positions in the National Football League, Jared Valdir. He has to be back. There's no ifs, no ands, no buts about this. You've got money to spend. You've got plenty of it. There's no reason not to bring a guy that is a core Raider back onto your roster. He needs to be back. There's really no discussion here. If he's not back, that's not really a good decision by the Raiders front office, and I think that's one that they will regret down the road, especially if they don't win this year. That'll be one of those moves they look back on and say, that probably got us fired. That was probably one of the moves in the offseason that got us fired. I expect him to be back. Jared Valdir needs to be back on this Raiders football team. Another guy that you look at and say, hey, this guy probably should be back. Defensive end Lamar Houston. And I know the numbers don't indicate that this guy is a big-time player, but if you look at him and what he's been able to do as a football player, he's grown as a player. He's starting to get pressure on the quarterback. He's great in the run game. This is a guy that wants to be back. Now, the numbers need to make sense. If the dollars make sense, just because you have $60 million plus in available cap space doesn't mean you need to spend all of it, okay? So just because you have a lot of money doesn't mean you need to go out and blow it. So Lamar Houston, just because the Raiders have money, it doesn't mean you need to get a huge deal. If the dollars make sense, make the deal. If they don't, then they won't. Simple as that. But you want Lamar Houston back if you are a Raiders fan. What about Charles Woodson? You know, Uncle Charles, back in the silver and black last year, thought he was solid. He's a veteran, a guy that is the mainstay of this football team. I don't see why you don't bring him back. I think he's got a little bit of football left in the tank. But again, if Charles is being greedy, and we know Uncle Charles can be a little greedy and needy. If he's being greedy, you tell Charles, all right, man, it's been fun, but we got to go. So what about another guy in that secondary? What about Tracy Porter? Okay, Tracy's got his games, his ups, his downs. But again, if you're the Raiders, you're building something, especially in that secondary. You spent the first round pick on a cornerback last year. And so it'd be nice to have a veteran in there like Tracy Porter, but you're looking to continue to build that secondary up. And so a guy like Tracy Porter, who I thought played well for you last year, is a guy that I think you should have back. Another guy that I think you should have back, Rashard Jennings. Darren McFadden isn't coming back, and I don't think you want him back. But Rashard Jennings, I think he proved last year that if nothing else, you can rely on me to play and be productive when I'm in the football game, whether you need me for short yardage, whether you need me to tote the rock 23 times in a game, I'll be there. Whatever you're looking for, I can provide it for you. And so Rashard Jennings is the guy that I think earned his way onto this roster. I think he's the guy that you want back. And last but not least, a restricted free agent. Jameez Olawale is a guy that is very versatile, much like Marcel Reese. Not the same athlete, but he's got a lot of athleticism at the fullback position. I think he's a guy that you can bring back if you are a Raiders fan. I think that's a guy that will be back for this Raiders football team. And now you move on to team needs for this Raiders club. And man, I just talked about purging the roster and starting anew. This Raiders team has a lot of team needs. So you start at the top, quarterback, okay? Quarterback. Got to have a quarterback. If you're the Raiders, think you got to draft one this year. No doubt about it. And I don't know if your first pick in the draft, first round, needs to be a quarterback or not. I really can't say if that's the direction they'll go in, but you need a quarterback. And I'd argue you need two. You need a starter, a stopgap guy that you can get in free agency, and then you need a young guy that you're grooming to be the face of the franchise down the road. So quarterback, definitely a need if you are the Raiders. You look at wide receiver, you need a number one receiver. You've got a bunch of 2s and 3s. You need a number one. I think the only guy that will satisfy your hunger for a number one receiver out on the market currently is New York Giants ex-receiver Hakeem Nicks. Now, Kenny Britt is telling everybody that will listen that he's a number one. I don't trust Kenny Britt at all. I think Hakeem Nicks is a guy that the Raiders will target in free agency. You look at another need for this Raiders football team. I just talked about Jared Veldheer needing to be back. If you bring Jared Veldheer back, then you don't need left tackle help. If you don't, then you do need left tackle help. I expect them to bring him back, but if they don't, they'll have a glaring hole on their offensive line. You look at the defensive side of the football, and this Raiders team needs help at defensive end, defensive tackle, cornerback, and safety. Now, if you bring Charles Woodson back and you bring Usama Young back, maybe you don't have a glaring hole at safety. But if you don't, guess what? You need to bring some other guys in, whether it be through free agency or the draft. You'll need safety help. What about cornerback? I just talked about several corners that are free agents that aren't coming back. I just talked about Mike Jenkins. I just talked about Tracy Porter. I talked about Phillip Adams. A lot of those guys, if not all of them, won't be back. So you're going to need some corner help either way you slice it, whether it be through free agency or the draft where you attack this need. It's a need nonetheless. You need cornerback help. You look at the defensive line as a whole, defensive end, defensive tackle. You need about 2 or 3 defensive tackles. I just talked about 2 of your defensive tackles, both starters from a year ago, probably not going to be back on your roster. So you need defensive tackle help. And then you look at defensive end. I talked about Lamar Houston and Jason Hunter. Hunter's not going to be back. Lamar Houston may be back, or he may not be back. Either way, you need defensive end help. I expect the Raiders to try to attack the defensive end position through free agency and look to bolster defensive tackle through the draft. Woo! That was a lot. The Oakland Raiders in 10 minutes, maybe 12 or less. 10 minutes or less. Like the content? Want more? Sub up.
In the lab